Hello everybody, this is Dr. Madhuri from Team MDSCONQUER. So now we'll discuss about the development of the face. Actually, they'll ask individually like development of the palate or a development of the maxilla or a mandible. But sometimes they can ask like completely you have to write about the development of the face. So now we'll discuss very briefly what to write when a question like development of face will arise. Okay. These are the contents of this video, like starting the introduction to the conclusion and references, which includes like prenatal development, development of skull, face, palate, tongue, maxilla and mandible, TMJ, and salivary glands. So coming to the introduction, usually this human face begins during the 4th week of our intrauterine life, and palate development occurs at the 6 to 8 weeks, whereas at the end of the 6th week, external face is completed. And the development continues in the 12th week with the completion of the soft palate. So prenatal development includes 3 successive phases. Okay, actually this development is divided into 23 stages. I mean like complete development. Okay, but and 3 successive phases like where germinal phase, embryonic phase, and fetal phase. So this is very important for us. There is neural tube and germ layers, and this actually here the our tissue and organs will differentiate after the formation of triploblastic embryo. Okay, then here we'll see this ectoderm. From this ectoderm, neuroplasty develops, where consists of neural folds and neural groove, completely forms the neural tube. Then from the mesoderm, somites like sclerotome, myotome, and dermatome will develop. And rhombomeres are important in the formation of the head. This is the formation of the notochord here. You can see starting there is a neural plate, then a neural groove appears and a fold, which formation leads to formation of neural crest cells and the neural tube completely. And here the entire notochord is seen. So you can represent this development in the form of pictures with only a few lines describing them. Okay. So head formation, actually I have told that rhombomeres help in the head formation, right? So you can see here there are 2 types of rhombomeres, rhombomere 1 and rhombomere 2. Rhombomere 1 helps in the connective tissue of the face formation, whereas rhombomere 2 is the first branchial arch. Then the stomatodium is called as a future mouth, and it is bounded cranially by the frontal eminence and caudally by the cardiac bulge. Okay, that which leads to the heart. And this is separated from the gut by a buccopharyngeal membrane. And in the formation of the neck, it is formed by the elongation of region between this stomatodium and pericardium. This is because a series of mesodermal thickenings called as pharyngeal or branchial arches appear. So this is branchial arches are very important. So you can see here, this is stomatodium, and this is the frontal prominence which leads to the head, and buccopharyngeal membrane. This is the gut and the cardiac bulge, and it is the future cardiovascular system. And this buccopharyngeal membrane ruptures at 24 to 26 days. And coming to our important subtopic in this development of face, that is branchial arches. So these arches are actually, there are 6 arches, but the 5th arch will disappear and only 5 will remain. Okay, then these pharyngeal arches are rod-like thickenings of mesoderm present in the wall of the foregut. These arches are separated externally by small clefts called as branchial grooves or a ectodermal clefts, and on the inner aspect you can see the small depressions which are called as a branchial pouches or a endodermal pouches. So you can draw this diagram representing the pharyngeal arch, like first branchial arch, second one, third one, and fourth and fifth. So this you can draw the diagram in the pharyngeal arches. So this table is very important. You can represent as it is, which is present in the table, like what is the first arch and what are the derivatives of subheading should be what is the arch, derivatives of the first arch muscles of the arch and nerve of the arch. So these should be your subheadings and these should be your contents. Okay, so the first arch derivatives are this Meckel's cartilage, incus, malleus, and sphenomandibular ligament. These are the muscles of the first arch, and this is the nerve of the first arch. In coming to the second arch, these are the derivatives of the second arch. These are the muscles of the second arch, and this is the nerve of the second arch. And here, if you learn this table, even if they give like any other muscles also, you can directly write the nerve supply directly, because if you learn this group of muscles here which is supplied by mandibular nerve, so if you get a muscles of mastication answer, then you can directly write the nerve supply like with mandibular nerve. So this table is important. Then third arch are derivatives, muscles, and the nerve supply. Fourth arch derivative, muscles, and the nerve supply. And the sixth arch derivatives and the nerve supply. Okay, fifth arch is disappeared, so hence it is not included in this table. Then there are two terms called as pharyngeal pouch and the cleft. You can see here this pharyngeal, remember two things, that's it. Pouch is lined by the endoderm, whereas groove, that is cleft, it is lined by the ectoderm. You can simply represent this diagram for the pharyngeal pouch and the cleft. Then starts with the development of face. It is derived from the two process, that is frontonasal process, and the other structure is first pharyngeal or the mandibular arch. So you can see here this is the frontal process, and this is the maxillary process, and this is the mandibular process. This diagram you can draw for the face development. So there are you can draw a limited amount of diagrams with the important points. Okay, so here you can see this mandibular prominence and this yellow color thing. You can color your diagrams also, so that this is maxillary prominence, and this is the frontal process, and here you can see the median nasal prominence, lateral nasal prominence, and external acoustic and meatus and the external ear. Then these mandibular arch consist of two processes, that is at the dorsal end maxillary process can be seen like this, whereas at the ventral end mandibular process is seen. Then this lower lip mandibular process of the two sides grow towards each other and they will fuse and form this lower lip. The upper lip is formed by the maxillary process, grows and fuses initially, then with lateral nasal process followed by the median nasal process. So all these processes combine and form the upper lip. So the mesodermal basis of this lip is formed by the frontonasal process, whereas the lateral part is formed by the maxillary process. Remember those points. You can see here the development of the lip. See, this is the maxillary process, overgrows the frontal process, and here you can see this fused mandibular process, and here you can see this maxillary process fuses with the lateral nasal process here, and this is the frontonasal process. Okay, this is the frontonasal maxillary process, lateral nasal process, and the maxillary process, and this is the mandibular process. You can draw any one of the diagram here which representing all the processes. Then coming to the cheeks, this maxillary process fuses with the median angle of the developing eye, and which formation of naso-optic furrow or the nasolacrimal sulcus. And these cheeks are formed, this maxillary and mandibular processes lateral to the stomatodium will fuse to form the cheeks. Then nose. Nose is formed by three processes, that is frontonasal process, medial nasal process, and the lateral nasal process. And there are called as olfactory placodes. And remember in this slides only very important points which you have to mention in the examination are given. So this is sufficient if they give for the development of the face. The frontal olfactory placodes, which are like localized thickenings of the ectoderm overlying the frontonasal process, and these placodes will sink below the surface to form a horseshoe shaped ridge. Then this nasal pits will have a two arms, that is medial arm and the lateral arm. Medial arm is the medial nasal process, where lateral arm will form the lateral nasal process. This both the lateral and the medial nasal process fuse with each other and form the external nares. So you can see here, this is the nasal placode, and this is the lateral nasal process, nasal pit, and the medial nasal process. So this is a line diagram where you can see maxillary process. This is the eyes, lateral nasal process, and the medial nasal process. And coming to the nasal cavities, and it is formed by the extension of the nasal pit. Okay, then primitive palate, it is a partition between pit and the stomatodium, which is formed due to fusion of the medial and the lateral nasal processes. And this nasal sac have a dorsal orifice and the ventral orifice. Dorsal orifice forms the nasal aperture, whereas the ventral orifice from the external nares. And with they both dorsally expand dorsally and caudally. And these are all the nasal cavities, and narrowing of the frontonasal process forms the nasal septum. So that completes the formation of the nose. Then coming to the eye, lens placodes are involved. These are the ectodermal thickenings present in the ventrolateral to the brain and lateral and cranial to the nasal placode. So they will sink below the surface and get cut off from the surface of the ectoderm. Then afterwards, eyeball will bulges laterally forwards, and then eyelids are developed from the folds of ectoderm and mesoderm. Then coming to the external ear, here it is formed around the first ectodermal cleft, and it is formed by the fusion of mesodermal thickenings. And this initially pinna will lie caudal to the developing jaw, but during the enlargement of the mandibular process, this pinna will pushed upwards and the backwards. So these are the developmental anomalies of the ear, like anoxia, that absence, synochiitis, that complete, like fusion, microtia, small ear, and auricular sinuses. So you can mention this developmental anomalies also. See, in any answer where if they are any question, if they ask about the development, you have to mention the anomalies also in the applied aspects. So coming to the paranasal sinuses, actually these maxillary and sphenoid sinuses will develop before the birth, whereas enlargement of sinus and enlargement of the facial skeleton takes place future. And anomalies includes like Down syndrome, where there is non-development of frontal and sphenoidal sinuses, Apert syndrome, whereas diminution or absence of the sinuses, and presence of metopic suture or diminution or absence of frontal nasal sinuses can be seen. Then coming to the development of palate, it consists of three components, that is two palatal process of the maxilla, primitive palate formed from the frontonasal process. So this is the primary palate, and these are the secondary palatal shelves, which finally leads to the fusion of the palate. So you can see here this intermaxillary segment, this is the flow chart. Like you can write like a sequence. The intermaxillary segment will give rise to philtrum of the upper lip, median part of the maxillary bone, incisors, and triangular primary palate. It forms a triangular primary palate. Then frontal section through the head, then it will forms like a vertical position of the palatal shelves on either side of the tongue. Then at the 7 to 0.5 week, embryo showing horizontal position of the palatal shelves above the tongue. You can see here. You can represent this diagram. And the last thing is a frontal section of this 10-week embryo showing the fused palatal shelves here. Okay, these are the stages where how like in the 6th week, 7th week, and the 10th week. If you can remember, you can include these points also, and one or two diagrams. Like you can directly draw the 10th week diagram. Then anomalies includes like cleft palate. You can represent with the pictures like unilateral cleft, complete unilateral cleft lip and jaw, and the jaw with unilateral cleft lip and anterior palate. Here the bilateral cleft lip, bilateral cleft of the posterior palate, and cleft palate combined with a unilateral anterior cleft. So you can represent these anomalies in the diagrams. Then other developmental disturbances include like of other all these things like Epstein pearls, Bohn's nodules, high arched palate, Marfan syndrome, cleidocranial, like this median palatal cyst or of Epstein pearls and Bohn's nodules, high arched palate can be seen. This is the developmental disturbance of palate. Can be seen in the higher Marfan syndrome, cleidocranial dysostosis, Clausen syndrome, progeria, Turner syndrome, and the Appert syndrome. Then these are the Epstein pearls you can see at the junction, whereas in the mid palatine raphe region you can see the Bohn's nodules. And the development of the tongue, coming to development of the tongue, this is very important. And here you can see like anterior 2/3 of the tongue develop from the tubercle impar and to lingual cell swellings. Posterior 1/3 develop from the hypobranchial eminence. Okay. So these are the anomalies of the tongue like aglossia, microglossia, macroglossia, physiotum, and ankyloglossia. Then coming to the development of the skull, here you can see like this morphogenesis can be blended into like neurocranium plus desmocranium plus chondrocranium, then face viscerocranium and masticatory apparatus. It is a blend of morphogenesis and growth of skull entities. So the skull is formed from the mesenchyme surrounding the brain, and this mesenchyme from the scleroderm of the occipital somoid help in the formation of the base of the skull. So the base of the skull is from the scleroderm, whereas otic and nasal capsules take part in forming the mesenchymal basis of the skull. And this mandibular and maxillary process, which are related to first branchial arch, is closely related to the developing skull. And these are the bones of the skull which are completely formed in the membrane list. And these are the complete bones of the skull which are completely formed in the cartilage and partly cartilage and partly membrane. So you can include this easy table in your answer if they ask about development of the face. Then these are the anomalies of the skull like anencephaly, scaphocephaly, acrocephaly, oxycephaly, plagiocephaly, and hydrocephalus. So you can draw these diagrams also, that plagiocephaly, oxycephaly, and trigonocephaly, triangle shape, enlarged microcephaly, and scaphocephaly, enocephaly. And coming to the development of maxilla, it includes like prenatal development and the postnatal development. Okay, it develops by the intramembranous ossification, and here anteriorly like this maxillary process of the first arch, center of ossification will be like posteriorly below the orbit towards the zygoma, anteriorly towards the incisors, superiorly to form the frontal process, inferiorly to form the alveolar plate, and partially to palatally to form the hard palate. And the zygomatic or malar cartilage, that is secondary cartilage, helps in the formation of zygomatic and alveolar process. Then postnatal development includes two aspects, that is shift in position of the maxillary complex and enlargement of the complex. And this postnatal development is because of these mechanisms. You can mention only the names which is sufficient, like suture connective tissue proliferation, ossification, surface apposition, resorption, and translation. And this is based on the principle of expanding V. So in this diagram, you can see this nasomaxillary complex as emerges beneath the cranium, whereas this expanded V is the, you can see here, expanded V in the downgrowth of the and forward of the maxilla. So you can draw this line diagrams. Then mandible prenatal development. Primary cartilage is of Meckel's cartilage, and initially osteogenesis at the bifurcation of the inferior alveolar nerve takes place, and the secondary cartilage includes condylar, coronoid, and the symphysial cartilage, and this is also based on the expanding V principle. And if you see in the postnatal development, this both develops by the endochondral and the intramembranous ossification. Okay, and this alveolar process and resorption occur. The alveolar process and posterior border of the ramus will develop after the 1 year, whereas this Distal superior surface of the ramus, condyle, and lower border of the lateral surfaces will develop during the first year of the life. Then disturbances of the jaws that to maxilla includes maxillary hypoplasia, Treacher-Collins syndrome, anhydrotic ectodermal hyplasia, Down syndrome, and the cleft lip and cleft palate. If you go with the distance of the jaw in the mandible, these are on the list of disturbances of the jaws of the mandible. Which is important here is the Parry-Robinson syndrome. Then development of the TMJ, here this develops because of the mesenchyme between the condylar cartilage of mandible and squamous tympanic bone. They convert it into a dense strip of mesenchyme, finally leads breakdown and forms the articular disc of the joint. Developmental anomalies includes ankylosis and functionless joint, that is mandibular maldevelopment. Then coming to the development of salivary glands, this includes formation of analog and development of gland with dichromatic branched duct, differentiation and early formation of the lobules and canalization, and structural maturation and duct differentiation. These are the stages in the development of salivary glands. Developmental anomalies includes agencies, hypoplasia, atresia, aberrancy, Stephanie cyst, anterior lingual depression. So these are the references for the development of the face. So in this video, I have given a brief idea of all the things which are included in the development of face. So if they ask like broadly development of face, you can include all these points which I have covered in the video and few diagrams and the tables like bones of the skull and this thing pharyngeal pouches. They are very important. So don't forget to include these two tables when they give the answer like development of face. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a nice day.